We continue now at the top of Daf Chaf Beizam and Beizam Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 22b. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked whether the Meiki or the waters of the basin, do those waters need to be Mayim Chayim, flowing water, spring water, or can it be any kind of water in the Meiki? And the Gemara in the previous summit brought a proof from a Brisa. The Brisa is discussing the washing of the innards of animal karbonos. And the Brisa says that you can use water and kal v'chomer. Certainly, you can use the mei kior. And the question is, what does the Brisa mean when it says kal v'chomer for mei kior? And so the Gemara initially understands we're not talking about the actual water of the kior. We just mean water that is similar to the water of the kior, meaning mayim chayim. That's what the Brisa means, and that would indicate that the waters of the kior should in fact be mayim chayim. But then the Gemara said, no, that's not what the Brisa means at all. The Brisa is talking about the actual waters of the kior, and since they have a certain amount of kedusha, that's why the Brisa said a kal v'chomer. Certainly you can use the mei kior. But the Gemara then continued and asked, is that really the case? Can you really use the mei kior in this context? But the Talmud Shmuel says that anytime it says the word mayim, it means mayim and not mayim that has a shem lavoy, that has like a modifying name. It just has to be referred to as water, as opposed to, let's say, the mei kior, which is referred to as the water of the kior. And so you see, anytime it says mayim, it just means regular water and not something like the mei kior. So that could not be what the kal v'chomer meant in that brisa, that kal v'chomer, you can use the mei kior for washing the innards. And so rather, again, it does seem to indicate mayim chayim. And the Gemara now continues with the Tana Devei Shmuel. Again, it has to be water and not water that has a shem levoy. So yatsu mei kior, that excludes something like the waters of the kior. Sheyesh lahem shem levoy, that's not just called mayim, that has a modifier on the name. And so therefore, again, that will be excluded. And so the Gemara continues, elalav, rather is it not? What is the explanation of the Brisa from the previous Amud? To ru'uyin lemei kior, it means to say a kal v'chomer, water that is fit to be the waters of the kior. Alma mayim chayim nenu. You see that the waters of the kior are mayim chayim, they are flowing water or spring water. And the Gemara continues, Tanoihi, let us say that this is a machlokas Tanoim. The Yomar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said, mei kior, when it comes to the waters of the kior. Rabbi Yishmael Omer mei mayon hein. Rabbi Yishmael says it's spring water. V'chachamim Omer, and the chachamim say, shar mei mosein, it can be other waters as well. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Orel, somebody who's uncircumcised, the Kohen who's uncircumcised, who does the avoda, so that avoda is going to be profaned, it will be disqualified. And the Gemara says, Menolan, from where do we know this? Amar Rav Chisda says, Davar zemi Toras Moshe Rabbeinu lo lamadnu. This matter is not learned from the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. Rather, midivrei Yechezkel ben Buzi lamadnu. Rather, it is learned from the words of Yechezkel, from Sefer Yechezkel. The pasuk says, Kol ben nechor erel leiv v'erel basar lo yavo el mikdashi. It says, anyone who is erel leiv or erel basar should not come to my mikdash. And erel leiv, as we'll see in a moment, is somebody who sins regularly. He's an apostate. And an erel basar, that's somebody who's uncircumcised. And it could be referring to, let's say, an individual who his brothers died because of Mila. He might be a righteous individual, but because of those concerns, therefore he was uncircumcised. So it says, Lo Yavo al Mikdash, he shouldn't come to my Beis HaMikdash. That's where we learn the idea of Orel is disqualified from doing the Avod in the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara continues and asks, Umenolan demachli avoda, from where do we know that if an orel, if an uncircumcised Kohen does the avoda, that avoda is profaned? Tichsiv, because it's written also again in Sefer Yechezkel, B'haviachem, b'nei nechor, arle leiv, arle basar, lios, b'mikdashi, lechalas, basi, it says you brought, b'nei nechor, you brought in people who were arle leiv and arle basar to be in my mikdash, and it says lechalas, basi, and therefore the word lechalal indicates demachli avoda, again that the avoda is profaned. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Tanu Rabban, and the rabbis taught ben nechor. It says again in this pasuk, Kol ben nechor, erel levi, erel basar. What does it mean, ben nechor? Yachol ben nechor mamish. One might think that it actually means a ben nechor. It actually means somebody who's not Jewish. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says erel lev. It says he has an uncircumcised heart, and so therefore we're not talking about an individual who's not Jewish. Imkain ma Talmud Lomar ben nechor. If so, what does the pasuk mean when it says ben nechor again in Yechezkel? What it means is that his deeds have become estranged from his Father in heaven. That's what we're referring to over here. Again, we're talking about an individual who's an apostate, somebody who regularly sins. And the Brisa continues, now I only know that it's problematic by an erelev. Erel basar, what if he's uncircumcised in the flesh? Minayin, from where do we know that that is problematic? Talmud lomar v'erel basar. That's what the pasuk says, v'erel basar, that's uncircumcised in the flesh. And the Gemara says, it's necessary for the pasuk to teach us both. The Yikasav Rachmana erel basar, because if the pasuk only wrote erel basar, mishum demois, I would say that individual is considered considered to be disgusting, and that's why he's not able to do the avoda. Avol era leiv, but somebody who is an era leiv, he's uncircumcised in the heart, the lomois, that would not be considered disgusting. A malo, I would say maybe he's not disqualified. V'yashmin an era leiv, and if it only taught us era leiv, as somebody who's uncircumcised in the heart, mishum de'ein libo lashamayim, because such an individual, his heart is not turned towards heaven. Avol erel basar, but when you have someone who's uncircumcised in the flesh, so that might be a tzaddik, the libo lashamayim, it could be a person whose heart is to heaven. A malo, I would say the disqualification would not apply, and so tzrichi, that's why it's necessary to teach that both erel leiv and erel basar are disqualified from avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Tameh pasul, if you have a Kohen who's Tameh, so his avodah in the Beis HaMikdash is pasul, is disqualified. And the Gemara says, Amru ziknei darim, the elders of the south, they said, Lo shanu el Tameh sheretz. We're only talking in the Mishnah about a Kohen who is Tameh sheretz, he becomes Tameh to a creeping creature. Avol Tameh mace, but if we're talking about a Kohen who's Tameh mace, he becomes Tameh to a dead body. Mitoch shemeratze betzibor, since Tumas mace is accepted by a communal carbon, meratze nami biyachet, so will also be accepted by an individual carbon. And Rashi explains, Tameh pasul, a Kohen whose Tameh is disqualified, Masnisin koi. We're going here on the Mishnah, the Tanan b'Masnisin, because we learned in the Mishnah, Tameh mechal avoda, that a Kohen who's Tameh, he desecrates, he profanes the avoda. The al karchach b'karban yachid kamer, it has to be talking about an individual carbon in the Mishnah. The ilu carbon sibor karv betuma, because a carbon sibor, a communal carbon, actually is brought betuma. And the Gemara then said, Mitoch shemeratze b'tzibor, since it's accepted b'tzibor lechatchila, meaning by tumas mace, that's accepted lechatchila when we're talking about a communal carbon. So meratze b'yachid di'evet. So after the fact, if you have a private carbon, an individual's carbon, it will also be accepted when you have the tumas mace. Al yedei shahat tzitz meratze ola, because the tzitz is going to affect acceptance. And Rashi notes, V'haidavid tumas mace. Now the fact that by tumas mace, pshita lon, it's obvious, techsib b'moado, because it says you're going to bring the carbon in its time. V'afilu b'tumah, and you're going to bring it even b'tumah. Mashma, so that's understood. Bein shekohen tameh, bein shahat tzibor tameh, and whether the kohen is tameh, whether the tzibor is tameh. If you have a majority of tumah, it doesn't matter if the kohen is tameh as well. Umidegoli b'duchta achrisi gabe tumas bailim, and from the fact that it's revealed in another context by tumas bailim, dechi ishtaroi tumah b'tzibor, that when we have this permission to have tumah by a communal carbon, b'meis ishtaroi, it's specifically by tumas meis. Ishki tameh lenefesh. That's what it says in the pasuk. Yalfinan mina ish nidcha ve'in tzibor nidach. And we learn from there that an individual is pushed off because of tumah, but not a tzibor, not the community. So therefore we say afgabe kohen hamaratza nami b'meis ishtaroi, by the kohen also who's affecting the acceptance of the carbon. We're talking specifically where the kohen also is tameh meis. And the Gemara continues and asks, Ihachi, if so, Tameh Sheretz Nami, Lacey Bekal V'chomer, Mi Tameh Meis, a Kohen who's Tameh Sheretz also, we should include that using a Kal V'chomer from Tameh Meis, meaning we should say, just like a Kohen who's Tameh Meis can affect the acceptance of the carbon sibor, so to a Kohen who's a Tameh Sheretz should be able to affect the acceptance of a carbon sibor. We should say as follows, Ma Tameh Meis Shaton Hazah, Shlishi Ushvi, if a Tameh Meis who requires sprinkling on the third and the seventh day, that's a more severe kind of tumah, meratze, he can affect the acceptance of the carbon sibor. So tamei sheretz, so also a tamei sheretz, she'eno taon hazah gimel ushvi, who does not require sprinkling on the third and the seventh day, eno din shemeratze, shouldn't it be true that he can affect acceptance of a carbon sibor? And the Gemara continues and answers to that, Kasavri ziknei darim, the elders of the south, they hold mechaprin kemischaprin. Those who are creating the kapara, the kohanim, have to be like those who are mischaprin, those who are receiving the kapara, essentially the owners, so to speak, of the carbon. Ma mischaprin tamei meis in tamei sheretz lo, just like by the mischaprin, we're talking about specifically where they have tumas meis and not tumas sheretz. Af mechaprin, so too by the kohanim who are creating the kapara, tamei meis in tamei sheretz lo. We hold this only, this exemption, so to speak, applies by tamei meis, but not by tamei sheretz. And Rashi explains, Ihachi lo garsin, and Rashi takes out the words Ihachi in the Gemara. Tamei sheretz nami lacey bekal v'chomer. Tamei sheretz also we should include from a kal v'chomer demeratze betzibur lechatchila, meaning that a kohen who's a tamei sheretz should create acceptance lechatchila for a carbon sibur. Bekal v'chomer mi tamei meis, we should make a kal v'chomer from tamei meis. And the Gemara continued and answered, Kasavri ziknei darim, the elders of the south, they hold the amri meis dafka, that they say only by tumas meis mechaprin kemischaprin, that those who create the atonement are like those who receive the atonement. Meaning, kishahutra tuma b'tzibur, when the tuma was permitted for a communal carbon, shneim hayu b'mashma. So both were included. HaKohen v'hatzibur, the Kohen who's tamei and the community that's tamei. Dahami moado nafkolon, because we learn it out from the word moado in the pasuk. Hilkach, therefore Kohen kitzibur. Therefore we compare the Kohen to the tzibur. Ma kishahutra tuma etzel rov tzibur. Just like when tuma was permitted by the majority of the public, kishenitmu, when they become tamei, that's tamei meis hutter velo tamei sheretz. That was specifically by tamei meis and not tamei sheretz. Af kishahutter lekohen b'karban tzibur. So too by the Kohen, when it's permitted for him by the karban tzibur, meis hutter velo sheretz. It's only tomas meis that's permitted and not tomas sheretz. But the Gemara continues and asks, "My Kosavri, what exactly do the Ziknei Darim, the elders of the south, what do they hold? I Kosavri ein shochten v'zarken al tamei sheretz. If they hold that you're not allowed to slaughter or throw the blood on one who is tamei sheretz, so amaylo avdi tzibur b'toma. Why is it that the tzibur is not able to bring their carbon b'tomas sheretz? Hakol shebi yochid nidche. The rule is anytime by an individual it would be pushed off. So tzibur avdi b'toma. The tzibur is able to bring the carbon b'toma. And so the Gemara therefore says, Ella rather Kasavri, they hold Shochten Vizarkin al Tamei Sheretz, that one is allowed to slaughter and throw the blood for an individual who's Tamei Sheretz. And Rashi explains, "My Kosavri Ziknei Darim." Again, what do the elders of the south hold? The pshitalahu, that it's so obvious to them. The lo hutra tumas sheretz eitzel rov tzibur, that tumas sheretz would not be permitted if the majority of the community had tumas sheretz. V'teisi b'kal v'chomer, and if that's the case, again, then we should be able to learn out the kal v'chomer. I Kosavri in shochten v'zarkin. If they hold that you're not allowed to slaughter and throw esa pesach, you're not allowed to slaughter and throw the carbon pesach al yochid tamei sheretz, on an individual who's tamei sheretz. And even though that individual can really immerse and eat the carbon pesach that evening, there is a man amar in Meseches Psachim that holds that way. He learns it out from the pasuk. It says if a person is tamei nefesh, even if the seventh day, even if Erev Pesach is the seventh day of his purification process, that's how he understands the pasuk. The Havalei Katamei Sheretz, which essentially is the same as Tamei Sheretz, who is going to be pure in the evening. So again, if such an individual who will be able to eat the Karban Pesach technically, by the time the Karban Pesach is eaten, if we hold that Ein Shochten V'Zarken, that you're not allowed to slaughter for such an individual, so then the question would be why tzibur it's not permitted. Amai lo avdi tzibur b'tuma. Why wouldn't the tzibur be able to bring the carbon with Tumas Sheretz? Hakol shebiyachid nidche tzibur avdi b'tuma. The rule is as long as an individual is pushed off because of that tuma, the tzibur is able to bring the carbon b'tuma. The ish v'lo tzibur kamar achmana, because that's the whole derivation of the pasuk, is an individual and not a tzibur. There's a permissibility for the tzibur. And Rashi continues, elasavri lahu, rather the ziknei darim, they hold kimando amar hasam, like the one who says over there, shochten v'zarken al tamei sheretz, that one is allowed to slaughter and throw the blood for an individual who's tamei sheretz. Hoel v'chazi lo'ursa, since at night he'll be able to eat from the carbon pesach. And hilkach, therefore, tzibur tamei sheretz, if you had a tzibur, if you had a community that was tamei sheretz, afhein lo huter lehen, it would not be permitted for them likones la'azara tamei, to enter the azara tamei. Ella, rather, what the tzibur would have to do in that case is yishlachu karbonoseim la'azara, they'd have to send their karbonos to the azara, v'yakrivu kohanim tahor, and then pure kohanim would have to bring the carbon, v'yitbelu v'yochlu la'erev, and then the community would immerse and they would be able to eat in the evening. To lo hutra lahem tuma, because tuma is not permitted for them. Ella b'makom she'ilu lo hutra hayu nidachin, only in a scenario where if it would not have been permitted for them, then they would have been pushed off, meaning biyachid. Hilkach, therefore, tamei meis she'eno muter lecho la'erev, a tamei meis who's not allowed to eat in the evening, so huter lahen, so then the tuma, meaning tumas meis, was permitted for the tzibur. Avol tumas sheretz lo, but by tumas sheretz that is not true. V'ein kan kal v'chomer, and therefore you don't have the kal v'chomer, you can't extend it to kohanim, shari yecholim la'asoso b'tahara, because again, it's possible for them to do it b'tahara. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ula says, Takalhu Reish Lakish Lidromai. Reish Lakish, he shouted at the Ziknei Darim, at the elders of the south. Again, the elders of the south said, just like we find by Karban Sibur, there's a distinction between Tumas Sheretz and Tumas Meis. By Tumas Sheretz, we say that's not permitted B'tzibur, and by Tumas Meis, we say it is Hutra B'tzibur, it is permitted B'tzibur. So too, we make that same distinction in terms of Karban Yachid, when our Mishnah says that if the Kohen is Tameh, and he does the Avodah, so then the carbon is disqualified, that's talking about a Kohen who's tummy with Tumas Sheretz. But when it comes to Tumas Meis, so b'di'evet, that carbon actually would be accepted. And so now Reish Lakish is arguing against the Ziknei Dorim, and he argues as follows. V'chi eze koach meruba, which is stronger, koach mechaprin or koach mischaprin? Are the mechaprin stronger? That would refer to the Kohanim, the ones who create the atonement, or the mischaprin, are they stronger? That refers to the owners, the ones who are receiving the atonement. Haveyomer koach mischaprin, the one that's stronger is the koach of the mischaprin, the owners of the carbon. Rashi explains, Takal hu tzak lohem kol gadol, he shouted at them, he yelled at them. Eza koach meruba lidchos es hatuma, meaning which one is stronger in terms of pushing off tuma. Haveyomer koach mischaprin, it's really the mischaprin which is stronger. And Rashi says, Kidemefarish v'yazel, as the Gemara will now go on to explain, Shahayachid tamei sheretz, the individual who's tamei sheretz, Mishaleach karbanu li'azara, he's able to send his carbon to the azara. Kidekam shochten v'zarken al tamei sheretz, like we said, they can slaughter and they can throw the blood for someone who's tamei sheretz. He can send his carbon. V'hakohen hamiratza bo, and the Kohen who's the one who's having it be accepted for him, im nitma b'sheretz. Let's say the Kohen would be tamei sheretz, pasul. So he's disqualified. Kidamuk misu mas nisan, like we've established in the Mishnah. That's how, again, the Ziknei Dorim explained the Mishnah. Zakatani tamei pasul b'tamei sheretz. That when it says tamei is pasul in the Mishnah, it means tamei sheretz. And so now the Gemara continues, and the Gemara says again, Haviomer koch mischaprin, it's the mischaprin that are stronger. And so now we can make the following argument. Uma b'mokom shenitmu bailim b'sheretz, if in a situation where if the owners are tamei sheretz, mishalchen karbonosein, like Rashi just said, they can send their karbonos, and Kohen shenitmu b'sheretz, but a Kohen who's tamei sheretz, eino meratza, so he's not able to allow the carbon to be accepted. So mokom shenitmu bailim b'meis, if you have a situation where the bailim are tamei meis, she'ein mishalchen karbonosein, where they're not able to send their carbon, Kohen shenitma b'meis, so if the Kohen is tamei meis, eino din she'eino meratza, wouldn't it be true that he would not cause the carbon to be accepted? And that goes against exactly what the Ziknei Dorim were arguing. And Rashi explains, Makom she'im nitmu bailim, yochid shenitma b'meis, meaning again, if you have an individual who's tamei meis, ein meshaleach pischo la'azara, he can't send his carbon pesach to the azara lishchot olav. He's not able to send his carbon pesach to slaughter. That's not possible. Ela nidche pesach sheni, rather he gets pushed off to pesach sheni. That's the whole halacha of pesach sheni, which is a halacha by the individual. Kedechsiv ish ki, like it says in the pasuk, every man who again is tamei. V'afagav dekocho meruba mishal kohen eitzel sheretz, even though the bailim they're in a stronger position. When we have the case of sheretz, they're in a stronger position than the Kohen. So Kohen shenitma b'meis, so now the Kohen who's tamei meis, eino din she'eino meratza, certainly he should not allow the carbon to be accepted. Sharei kocho ra mishal bailim eitzel sheretz, because again, the Kohen has less of a position, not as strong of a position as the Bailim do by Sheretz. Ve'amai amri Ziknei Dorim. And so the question is, why do the Ziknei Dorim say Meratza b'yochid migo de Meratza b'tzibur? Their whole argument is again that by the carbon yochid, the Kohen is able to allow it to be accepted by Tumas Meis because of the fact that again b'tzibur Tumas hutra b'tzibur, and so therefore again b'yochid they say Meratza, and that's the question: why should that be the case? And the Gemara continues and answers, Kasavri Ziknei Dorim, the elders of the south, they hold that they actually disagree with the premise. They hold Tamei Meis Nami, that by Tamei Meis also, Mishaleach Karbonosav, a Tamei Meis also is able to send his carbon. Rashi explains, Tamei Meis Nami Yochid Tamei Meis, meaning, if you have an individual who's Tamei Meis Nami Mishaleach Karbonosav, he can send the carbon Pesach. Kilomar means to say, Im Shilach Pischo LaAzara, if he sent his carbon Pesach to the Azara, V'shachtu V'zarku Olav, and they slaughtered and they threw the blood for him, Pater Milasos Pesach Sheni, he actually would not need to do Pesach Sheni. V'afa Bishalo Yochal Mimenu, and even though he's not going to eat from the carbon, to Kasavri Achilas Psachim Lo Makeves, because the Ziknei Dorim hold the eating of the carbon Pesach is not absolutely required. And Rashi notes, Umiu, nevertheless, L'chatchila Amar Rachmana, Nidcha Pesach Sheni. L'chatchila, really, he is pushed off for Pesach Sheni, but this just means after the fact, if he sends his carbon, so then he no longer does Pesach Sheni. V'tzibor Avdi B'tumah, now at Tzibor, again, if the Tzibor is Tameh, they would actually bring the carbon Pesach B'tumah. Hilkach, therefore, Kohen HaMechaper B'Karban Yachid, therefore their argument of the Ziknei Dorim is good. If you have a Kohen who is being Mechaper by a Karban Yachid, Mitoch Shemeratza B'tzibor, again, since by a carbon sibur tumas meis it is accepted, so lechatchila that's accepted lechatchila. So maratza biyachid di'evet, so then by a private individual's carbon it is going to be accepted as well after the fact. And the Gemara continues and asks, "V'haksib, but isn't it written in the pasuk ish ki tamei? If a person is tamei v'asa pesach b'chodesh hasheni, isn't there a halacha of pesach sheni? So what do we mean over here that a tamei meis, an individual who's tamei meis, can send his carbon on pesach rishon?" And the Gemara answers, as Rashi just said, "Lemitzvah, that's a mitzvah, that's lechatchila." But this is talking after the fact. If he does send the carbon, it will be effective. Rashi explains, "V'haksiv ishish v'asa pesach b'chodesh hasheni alma midchi." You see that he is pushed off again to do it on pesach sheni. And again, the Gemara answered lemitzvah. And the Gemara continues and asks, "V'haksiv, but isn't it written ish, a man?" And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph.